2, 3.
Awesome, thank you. Is anybody on the line?
We have a wireless caller on the line.
You get one?
This is Emily.
Oh, hey, Emily. Thanks for calling in. No, you didn't
Hi.
break it. It's totally fine. Let's tell us.
Tell Emily I'm here in person. Your vice chair also cares about you guys.
Our chair, Michael is here too, Emily. He brought
Yeah,
donuts.
I can hear him. Tell him I was there last week.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We're just waiting for Morgan to get back. He just took a little break. So I was gonna get my. Okay.
You can still sit at the table, you know.
Yeah, you can sit at the table. Unless you've got better things to do.
Joe wants to sit at the table.
Then you'll be held responsible for whatever happens.
You're welcome. Okay, so
The Wi-Fi.
you can use Mozilla Guest. Yeah, cool. So the first thing that I was going to pull up, so bringing this meeting to order, and I also talked to Andrew, and he said that we didn't have to use Robert's Rules of Order here.
You don't have to ever. Hate Robert.
Oh, yeah, I do too. Because it's a common misperception.
Yeah, I've spent my entire career representing boards, and I hate Robert's rules of
I'm with you.
Okay, so we are in agreement of not using Robert's rules, some of us with greater enthusiasm for not using them than others. So that's it. And then so we didn't have like a pre-arranged agenda for this meeting, but we have that list of questions to identify problems. So I think something that would be useful from my perspective is to kind of hone those questions and then turn them into next actions. Like, yeah, for each one of those questions, what should we do next? And so one thing that I think that I can do without too much trouble, and I'm going to do this without causing a bunch of microphone feedback, because that is within my skill set. So I think I can share this on the screen. I'm going to do this from Firefox, not Chrome.
We don't want to tell anybody.
That'll be a good one for the person who compiles notes. Okay. This is why we have selective editing. I have to use Chrome too. Okay. So, like, the questions that we had on here. So subcommittee's mission is to define PII and then also the questions and issues and concerns associated with that, and then make a recommendation to the broader group. So in the questions that I had from that email, the first one was, what are the different kinds of PII that would be covered? And then whether and how should different kinds of PII be treated differently? The next one was, what are the particular and specific issues people have with the way public records law addresses PII now? Third one was, in what ways should the law change? And then we had, what should never be exempt and what should always be exempt? And I'm not sure we all agreed on whether that was a good question for this. And then finally, we have the public interest reasons for why different kinds of PII should be disclosed. So in thinking about that, like the way that I try to solve problems like this is by like coming up with the definitions of things first. But I'm just like wondering how you all are thinking about addressing these things.
think there's already generally some pretty good definitions. PII statute that we can just steal.
Okay.
But I mean, it's already been compiled on rank, so with some of the statutes we were given, kind of start discussing this, sadly like 4 or 6 months ago.
Okay, just
So
in
it's
that
gonna be
original
essentially-
report.
Yeah, well, not in Ginger's report, but so I've got a list here of kind of the original stuff we were provided when we started looking at PII. So it's going to be social security numbers. There's multiple statutes for social security numbers. I think as far as it pertains to employees and statutes, we have like home address, personal cell phone numbers,
Email address.
email, yeah, personal email addresses. And of course, we've got a specific statute for email addresses of students within the university system. And there's a separate statute for the SSN of students within the university system, separate statute for SSNs for community college students, because why would we have one statute for that too? They've got a statute for the DMV that doesn't allow personal information obtained, which includes driver's license number, permit number, or ID card number. So I think driver's license number could go on that list.
Right.
My thought process is looking at this giant compendium of this stuff. I think looking at a definition is good because it'll allow to, I think there should just be one statute for all PII applicable to all public agencies rather than having it. You know, why do we have a separate statute for the SSNs contained by the DMV versus everyone else? Why is there separate statutory stuff for students' information versus anyone else who interacts with the government? I don't think there should be necessarily a distinction there. I know there's, I mean, my approach to increasing transparency, which is the goal of the entire Sunshine Committee. Obviously, I'm not a fan of carte blanche opening up everything, and I've probably been pretty vocal about that because I do believe a lot of stuff should be exempt from disclosure, but I do think you can increase transparency through a more common understanding of the law and it'll be more evenly applied throughout agencies. So I think for the PII especially, I think if we can get common definitions, common statutes applicable to everyone. So instead of like the 11 statutes we have in front of us, so like here's another statute for information for motor vehicle records from the DMV. If we can get all, I think a solid recommendation would be to find a way to get all of this consolidated down into one easier to read statute. If someone calls up and says, I'm looking for information, it's not a different statute based on which agency they're calling or which local governmental entity they're calling, and everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, what that information
Yeah.
is.
So if we just had a general rule, here's personal information, personal privacy that should be risk conditionally exempt from disclosure, then we can talk about what the ways the conditional exemption test makes it a lot simpler for everyone to apply.
Yeah, I think, so when you're saying that, you're talking about each one of the exemptions, right,
Yeah.
that exist. Okay, so I was thinking more of like the other direction of first starting with defining PII holistically, and saying, you know, here are all of the things, which is, I think, basically what you're saying.
Yeah, my thought is look at all the existing statutes we have in place for this stuff and see what they're all referring to as PII, and I could just make a kind of an omnibus definition.
Yeah.
So we got another one here, email address of a patron of a library district. Why do we need a separate statute for library card people when we could just say any kind of personal information that any governmental agency has, here's what it can be defined as personal information.
Right. And then so the frameworks that I've seen for this, like the one that we use for Mozilla, is something that talks about essentially like the degree to which that information individually identifies someone, and then that becomes, you know, like social security number, that's like one-to-one relationship, right? Email address, generally one-to-one. Home address, interestingly, you know, that might not be like a one-to-one, that might be something else. So it's good to kind of differentiate like between the different levels of sensitivity. So that's something else that I'm interested in, just like data classification and recommending. There's probably a classification system that exists at the state currently. I don't know what it is, but that's something that I wanted to request from the, you know, chief data officer or whatever agency is responsible for that, to find out what that is and then how that aligns with our definition of PII. Because I think that in order for any regulation here to be effective, it has to extend all the way through all of the data handling practices for the state. And like, you know, it gets, kind of have to get back to the issue of organizations that aren't completely computerized, but I think that we should still like have like a standard that starts from here's the different levels of data classification, and here's what falls into each one of those buckets. That's just like how my brain works about this, and what I've been struggling with actually in talking through this is like I don't feel like I have like a solid understanding of the classification system yet.
Okay.
I
I'm
don't
not sure
know.
there is one.
No, and I don't
That's
think
the
you can
problem.
create one would be an issue either.
Yeah.
So you represent mostly special districts, which
So
means that
districts,
outside of
cities and some counties.
yeah, okay, so I mean, outside of like some ports, most special districts would be relatively small, other than maybe like 12 Parks and
12
Rec.
12 Valley Fire and Rescue is the
They're
biggest
the-
one, yeah,
yeah.
but I don't represent them.
Yeah,
But there are about 1,000 special districts in Oregon, so that's
Yeah.
over and above the cities and the counties.
yeah, I used to represent schools, there's around 300 of them.
Yeah.
Each one's gonna be different, they're gonna have different types of information they receive. The county, just the county I work for is a relatively small county. I think our population is like 80,000 people. But we have so many different buckets of different information throughout our different departments that there'd be no way to really, I couldn't quantify different classifications of data that we receive just at our county level, because we've got law enforcement records, we've got parole and probation records, we have a giant behavioral health department with clients that we receive their personal information on. We've got personal information that our clerk receives both for marriage certificates, but also for property transactions, because they report all property transactions. We got personal information in the assessor's office for where tax statements are supposed to be sent to. We got personal information and you know, financial information in the treasurer's office from how they pay their taxes. We've got people who submit for building permits within our building codes. And those are all going to be different levels of information, or different, it's all going to be the same type of personal information that's going to be given to a governmental entity under different kind of auspices for each one of those. Like you're never going to be able to hide your property transaction records, but you would also assume your behavioral health records would never be released to the public. And that's just me at my desk at my office trying to develop a scheme that would work for the state, for cities and counties, for special districts, school districts, anything in between. I don't know if you could really come up with it. It's a really long way of saying this.
You know what's
I don't
like
want to say it's impossible,
so
but
weird about like, so I have such a different perspective, like with everything you described, it all fell into buckets for me.
yeah.
And so I think that's like maybe like something that I just want to try,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Is to look at not a fine-grained, you know, it can't be fine-grained, right? But we came up with a 4-level classification system for all the data that Mozilla collects. And it's based on things that can individually define or identify a person in isolation, things that when put together can individually identify a person, things that can identify a class of people, and things that don't personally identify. It was like very difficult to identify someone with that set of data. And so if you kind of look at it from that kind of a cut, it becomes like tractable, basically,
Yeah.
to apply some logic to it. And the way that I think about it is also like an information design. So we've got like these documents that people are filling out. And is there a way that we can propose to design those documents so that when there's the personally identifiable information as part of that document, you kind of put that information together, and then the other information that's being collected that might be part of something that you might want to report out on in aggregate, that might be in another part of the document. So then it makes redaction possible, right, in a much easier way than before if it's on paper.
Yeah.
You know, the technology side of it is a little bit different, but like that's sort of what I'm going for. I mean, I hear you on like going through and classifying all the existing records, but I would be also looking for something that was like forward-looking.
Yeah, no, I think,
Okay, it kind of sounds to me like we're not at the level of records, we're still at the level of trying to define PII, am I right?
Right.
Okay,
yeah,
all right. Maybe that would be a place to start, is to figure out when we talk about it, are we all having the same understanding of what's included in that bucket? And then from there, figure out,
well, I think we can come up with
can it
pretty
all be
easily
dealt
with
with the same way?
kind of a list we just put together would obviously fall into like the first box of Mozilla use stuff that could be directly tied to an individual one-to-one. I think obviously what we have, the SSN, home address, cell phone numbers, emails, driver's license numbers, will all fall into that.
Right.
There could be other records public agencies will have that would fall into, like, could be tied back to an individual, but not necessarily one-to-one. Might be, if you wanted to build a classification scheme like that, but then from there you have to have a correlating example of what doesn't go out, what does go out. Because that something that applies to each box. Like box one that goes one-to-one would be automatically exempt. The stuff that potentially can go back to an individual would be conditionally exempt from the balancing test.
Right. Well, and like I feel like the classification system supports easier decision making. Like just thinking from the archivist standpoint, like it supports easier decision making, but I don't think it's like the only thing that matters. Like, I think some of the things about research, like anti-corruption, and just like thinking like the core of what this group is supposed to be doing, which is increasing government transparency. There's certain things that, certain types of transactions that probably should be public, and that might include someone's name.
Yeah.
So I feel like, that there's an intersection there that needs to be defined, that there are these kinds of records that it's really important for, even though there is individually identifying information there, like that record still needs to be public. I feel like there should be, this is another like information request that I have, so I got this huge stack of public interest articles from the Journalists Association that were like, all of these stories were made possible by public information requests or whatever. But what was missing from that is they gave me the stories, but they didn't tell me what kind of information that they needed. Yeah. And I when they gave it to me, I told them that I needed them to like follow up on that and tell me what information it was that you used to do these stories. So I want to like just make that request formal, if that's okay. Just say from the committee, it'd be great if you could tell us like what is it that you need in order to do your work, and then link that to these public interest stories that are they're saying they're in the public interest, and all of these that I've seen, they appear to be that way too. So that's not, I don't think that will be terribly controversial, but I think that's like an important like linkage that's been maybe missing, is there's been a lot of like, the media needs access to these records, but then we're not kind of like linking it all the way to, and here's the result when you have access to these records. Because there was also like, I didn't highlight it, but in some of these pieces that we got, from the Society of Professional Journalists, there's, some stuff about accountability and anti-corruption, and that we don't have very much corruption in Oregon, and that's because we have like this pretty good access to public information. But again, like I want concrete connections between those things so that we can actually see what it is that's enabling. Because I think we have counterexamples too, right? Like we've had testimony about places where access to that information was damaging to individuals.
I would agree. I mean, the first thing we could probably do is define what's on the PII list. I was just looking at the prompts Michael sent us before our last meeting, things we, just what we could just simply identify as falling on that list. My take on this is that I think my concern has always been and remains that a single statute that identifies what's exempt is going to put under the cloak records that are already public and should be public. You said you can never hide property transaction, right? I don't know. If we say addresses are exempt except for public interest test, it is possible that an assessor or a recorder's office someplace could say, you can't have that address. voter registration records. The legislature has already taken away date of birth, which is not only an essential fact or verifying technique for not just journalists, but for researchers, right? Address could be next. There's a legislator who successfully made almost everything of his or her records completely, gone from the public record. I'm not quite sure how this person did it. But that could easily happen if we're not careful. And that's not our mission here. Our mission is to preserve what's here and try to clarify, if an agency is going to, because there's already things that are conditional, clarify what does that mean to be conditional? Because I think the issue for a lot of folks is not that there's too much information out there, is that there's too many ways to have agencies withhold it. I'm really sympathetic or empathetic with those like small governments or local governments that just don't know what to do. So to the degree which we can help clarify and sharpen that would be fantastic. My concern is that we end up inviting the removal of a lot of stuff from what's already public access, because a lot of it's disappearing already. So I understand that there's privacy tensions, but I'm also not real willing to have us recommend that we shut everything off because of a potential worst case scenario.
So essentially, your concern is if we try and oversimplify it, it's going to be too broad of a brush.
Yeah, for example, let me use exaggeration, just to make an example. If we said everybody should have the same degree of protection of their personal information, well, I'm not sure I would, from a citizen's perspective, if a judge or a police officer wants to continue to keep her home address confidential, that'd be fine. Right now, police officers can use the police, I believe this is still the case, they can use the police headquarters address for their driver's licenses or for other things so they can help keep their personal information. So if we went to that standard for everybody, all of a sudden everything would be shut down. So I think we have to be really careful when we say everybody's under the same. I think it becomes really hard because I think we would agree. We don't want to take away some of the protections that have been debated and considered and most people would agree on. But on the other hand, we don't want to apply that to everything because that would be quite a broad shutdown. So that's my concern, how we phrase it, that's all.
Yeah.
I wonder if defining, so I guess like one way I would interpret what you just said is that just even defining PII is problematic.
It could be, but I think for our purposes we need to do it, and I think there's also this consideration of names, right? I don't think people would say, you could argue names are never really what we're talking about, but when you combine them with addresses, then that suddenly becomes PII.
Yeah.
I'll give you a quick example. I have reporting students who use court records to look at whether or not police are targeting or focusing on the homeless population or people without a permanent address. You could do that without the name, but you'd have a tough time figuring out whether you're double counting people in the court system. But you can't do that if the address is taken out. So there's that is, for example, a problem of when you pair two things up. When you separate them, rather, they're not useful for those purposes. And it's not just from the journalist perspective. There's a lot of public interest reasons for keeping a lot of this stuff available. So that's my concern is that we come across as advocating a broad shutdown of some of this information, as opposed to finding a way to help sharpen and clarify and give some more certainty to what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I'm willing to talk about any approach here that folks are.
Well, I think it's an overarching point of kind of the subcommittee is, we're not going to come out of here with a draft bill.
That's right.
That fix everything.
That's right.
And I'm not even sure we're going to be able to do it point by point for for every single statute. This one's good, this one's bad, this one's thumbs up, this one's thumbs down.
Yeah.
So I think any recommendation that comes out of here is gonna have to be a little bit more 30,000 foot level than actually, you should do this, you should do this, and you should do this. It should be, some of the statutes should be, you know, I mean, off the top of my head, something along the lines of personally identifiable information should be essentially defined at some point. The release of it should be subject to a balancing test, maybe have, I like some of the ideas from other states that it can be subject to restrictions of redisclosure upon disclosure. I don't necessarily like the idea of, you know, journalists get access to this, but the lay public doesn't, which seems to be kind of the theme of some of the testimony we've got before, because it just leads to a secondary problem of the public entity trying to define what a journalist is. And in my experience, it's not subject to easy definition, but I do like the concept of releasing information to an individual who's requesting it, and then have the onus on them not to redisclose it or use it at any purposes contrary for why they asked for it. And I think we could put recommendations like that together that would be useful for any future legislative changes without getting into the minutiae that we're probably never going to agree on, especially in a bigger group outside of this group.
Yeah.
But that's just a thought I'd put out there.
Okay, that makes sense. I agree about not drafting legislation. No, I agree with that approach.
And I think that's part of the issue. We got kind of bogged down in some of the PII stuff because we tried to look at each exemption individually. It's like, that's going to be a slog that we just don't have time for.
So can I offer a suggestion? I think maybe we try to, at least for our purposes, identify what we're talking about as PII.
Mm-hmm.
For example, you were talking about student records, medical records. That's already federally exempt.
Oh, yeah.
All that stuff, right?
Which is why we don't need statutes for it in Oregon, but that's just.
Right, so I don't think that's even in our, right. So maybe we can figure out what we are talking about, because I think that will help the full committee. So,
Yeah.
Well, we got a list started.
yeah, and you know, Michael sent us a prompt last time, and had a list of,
Yeah, I thought I had printed that out, and then
Yeah.
of course I'm not.
so,
This is going back to, is it from the decision points?
yes.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
we have that.
And not in any particular, well, the order that they're here, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, home address.
Yep.
Personal telephone.
Yep.
Email addresses, dates of birth. I don't know what administrative generally tracking numbers might be. That might be work employee ID.
Employee
numbers.
IDs,
Okay,
yeah.
very good. Business addresses. I don't mean to laugh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, what did you say?
This is a physical address of a licensed person or entity conducts or owns a licensed business. Should work emails be exempt? These are the prompts, these are the decision points that we gave us. So,
Yeah.
so that might be a place to start of winnowing or adding from that list. So we can at least talk about what we're.
Yeah, okay, so that's that complete list here, so I guess this would be personal
Yeah.
email.
Yeah.
Personal financial information.
Like,
And that's the other thing, we're going to have to self-define all of that.
What's in hers and what,
Hers. I mean, what kind of financial info do your clients get from constituents? We're going to have information like bank numbers, financial numbers, and a lot of the mortgage documents we record. We're going to have employees, we're going to have all sorts of information on them, bank account numbers and all stuff for
yeah.
payroll.
Can I offer a piece of information to you guys?
Yes.
That may be
Absolutely.
helpful in this discussion.
Only if you sit at the table. There's a no peanut gallery rule.
I think that's like you to eat a donut.
Yeah, so bring the
Every
donuts
time
with you,
Michael
it'll be
talks, I
better.
eat a donut.
And pass them around, actually,
Yeah.
everyone should eat them.
I don't know if
Like,
everyone-
right across the street there.
Vanilla donuts are good.
Oh my god. But I just wanted to say that, so we ended up putting like the PERS exemption in this list because it is used to protect things like addresses and phone numbers. We have a separate category of exemptions that we'll be getting to that are specifically about like the financial information. So I would really be looking at, to the extent there are a few exemptions in here that are broader, be thinking about them in terms of how they apply to information that's like the other kinds of more specific.
So we can deal with that later is what I'm hearing?
The financial,
I
like
that.
people's financial information, yeah, there will be another opportunity to talk about that.
Because however we feel about that, I mean, our purse balances, right, don't identify us necessarily, I think, right? I think so. But yeah. Okay.
Do we all agree that's a comprehensive list of what we consider PII? I mean, assuming that we take the financial stuff off. We didn't say names. I'm assuming that we're all in agreement that that is not going to be exempt from disclosure.
No, I think so.
Right. Although it kind of already is. I mean, for example, customers of utility providers, water and sanitary customers, the entity can withhold the names of the people who live it. They have to disclose the addresses, but they don't have to disclose the names of the people who live there. So it's not always assumed that the name is going to be made available.
I think the issue there is probably the fact that the two pieces of information in conjunction are problematic because it ties. You know, utility bill to an address doesn't mean much, but as soon as you find out an address and the name of the person that lives there, that's what's problematic.
In the personal safety option, that people can request protections from, you know, they can request that a public entity not disclose their name, their address, any of that personal information. They have an affirmative obligation to request it. They have to do it in writing, but then that puts the onus on the public entity to not disclose any of that, because the reason the person can do that is that they fear for their safety. Either they or someone in their family is being threatened or is likely to be threatened or something. So I always tell my clients, just assume that if you get that request that you don't have to verify it, you just have to take the word for it. So there is a strong, and we heard some of it from the testimony from the people who attended our earlier meetings, is there is a personal safety component. Having been a public employee who was threatened by other public employees who found out where she lived, I guess that's a compelling thing that I would like us to not treat lightly, just in the interest of you know, sunshine.
Yeah, but it also can conceptually, if we start moving towards a concept of more disclosures unless we get the request from the person to not disclose it because of personal reasons, I have concerns about that because it's a matter of access and understanding. How many people in the general population know that, oh, well, if I go to my utility, I can ask them to not release my number. They're not going to know.
That, yeah, and the bad guys, we'll get to it first.
Yeah. Well, I think it was Ginger McCall's testimony like 2 meetings ago that's saying, you know, she didn't have any concerns about people tracking down where she lived because she knew how to keep herself, you know, practically invisible. That wasn't the term she used, but it was close to that. It's like, well, yeah, if you knew to buy property in the name of a trust with a PO box, you could go and get your property owned and recorded with the county, and no one would know that you lived there. But the percentage of the population that has the means and knowledge to know that is pretty minimal. So if there actually are safety issues with releasing some of this information, I think it's a little bit better policy-wise to assume the safety issues are going to be, should withhold the disclosure of the information without just a request, because you can't assume everyone out there, the people in the general public don't know that these options are available to them. So it's almost kind of an empty promise of protection for personal safety if people don't know.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I guess that policy approach assumes that most of the people requesting information are bad actors.
I don't think it assumes most are. I think it assumes that there is a percentage of those who are, and the reason why that personal privacy protection option was added was just, it's for relatively recent, I'd say 10 years ago or so, because there were people who were easily accessing that information through public utilities. If your ex-husband wanted to track you down and hurt you, and you thought you were hiding from him, but he was able to get it easily through the local utility provider, and you know there was a push in the legislature to try to put in some protections for people who are in that position. So I don't know that, I wouldn't say it's the majority, but I think that we tend to default in our conversations in the group about what do journalists need. And I think that is an important criterion, and most of my clients are more than happy to accommodate journalists, but they have also an obligation to make sure their employees are protected and that the bad guys, and there are plenty of them out there, we see them all the time, if the journalists have free access to this information and we treat it very liberally, then anybody who wants it can also do the same. And so I think we have to have that discussion. From a policy standpoint, one of the things that I liked in the materials that Ginger provided was the consideration of the person who's requesting it. Is there a legitimate business reason to need that information? Like you're a journalist and I need this for my story. That to me sounds like a legitimate, I mean, obviously we're going to get to questions of verification, which is another issue, but if someone came to one of my clients and the test was, do they have a legitimate business interest to know this, and they have press credentials and they're able to make, confine their request to what they need and so on, that's one decision. But if somebody comes and says, I just want to know where, give me all the addresses of all of your, your female patrons or something like that, if there's no genuine business interest to know that, then I would like my clients to be able to say, well, we don't have to do that. So you see that the tension there, obviously, and that's why we're kind of at this kind of impasse in our discussions, is that there are legitimate policy positions for each side. So if somebody were to come and ask, I mean, some of the people who came and testified in our earlier meetings about, they just don't want their personal address disclosed because it doesn't have anything to do with the work that they do. They are public employees, they go to work, fine, you can come and shoot me there if you have to, but don't come to my house and shoot me, and it shouldn't be easy for you to track me down and find me. So I think that's an important distinction to make as well, is if there's no legitimate business reason to need the information, or as a general rule, one wouldn't need that information to conduct business, then I think that carries some weight, or it should.
Yeah, I think a counterpoint to that is that we don't, like, and not to like all of that, I just mean like in terms of like classes of information that someone might need for like research purposes or like analyzing a public policy problem. Say like you were studying redlining. And you wanted to get information about all of the mortgages that were given to like different classes of people, and you wanted to know like, what race, gender, whatever that they had indicated on their application. I like getting that information for a long time was difficult. I think now it's like a lot easier, but I could see in the future there being some public interest reason why you might want that, and the agency that had that information wouldn't want to provide it because it would expose systemic bias. So that's the cases that are like coming to mind for me, is like in a situation where someone's investigating something that just inherently is problematic, like because there's like bias or discrimination, like how do we allow for that to emerge and for that to like happen without it in a situation where we're like shutting off by default access to a lot of this kind of information.
So just to play out that example, if let's say you were doing a research project on that very issue, like redlining.
Yeah.
What personal information would you be seeking that you feel you wouldn't be able to get?
Well, on this list, it would probably be like home address. If I was researching, I'd probably want to reach out to these people, so I'd need some kind of contact information. So like email address, I'd probably be interested in dates of birth. Yeah, I mean, I've already hit upon 3 or 4 things here, and telephone number, right? Because I want to see in aggregate, like what's going on. And then I want to reach out to those individuals and find out like what their circumstances are, right? Like what happened in the transaction.
Would there be another way to approach that, like finding a way to sort of query, put out a general query, a mailer or something like that, and just say, if you have information on this subject, please call me? I mean, could that be done short of just opening up all that data to anybody who wants it?
I don't know. Some of the maps that I've seen that have been generated from this type of information, they are based on very fine-grained detail of like which mortgages were granted by which lenders, and then who those people are, like researching that. So like, and I'm like not an expert in like that particular area of research. I've just like seen maps that people have drawn, and it's very detailed, right? And I don't know that you get to the heart of the problem without having quite a bit of detailed information. So I have, like I struggle with this in my work because there's a lot of personally identifiable information in all of the information that we collect about browser behavior, right? And so we try to limit that as much as possible. But sometimes, we collect stuff that really could like individually identify people like crashes. And so there's an opt-in process for that, like on our end. But I think it's a very different thing with a private company, like we're privately held, and when it's government policy that's implementing some system. Like I think that it's really important for people to be able to look into the effect of a government policy by looking at all of the data that's available there. And so like for me, like in looking at some of the conversations we've had, I don't know that we can get away from having some kind of conversation about purpose, the purpose of the request and like who's requesting it. Yeah, like, cause I don't see how to get out of this, cause I don't think that all government information should just be like available to everyone at any time whenever they want it. That doesn't make sense to me. But I want people to be able to look at government policy, look at the data that was collected, and to be able to draw conclusions from what's happened that's different maybe than like the person that's in charge of the agency that's implementing that policy.
Like there's two different sides of that as well. As far as kind of a matrix for whether something is socially acceptably released. It's not just the reason why the person is asking for it, but also the mode in which the public agency received the information. Was it a voluntary submission that they chose to do? Was it something they absolutely had to do, mandatory? Or was it something they didn't have any choice in at all as far as how the information came in the hands of a public entity? And I think that can play into the analysis for whether it's something that should be released or not. So it's something else we can consider. Is it something that you absolutely have to give the government in order to do something? Is it something you chose to essentially opt in to have that information being held in a public agency? Obviously, everything, because I think you could say if you've opted into submitting some kind of personal information to the government, you have more or less chosen to have that somewhat available under the Sunshine Laws. If you had no choice but to participate in this, kind of like one of the statutes we look at is the withholding of private information from divorce proceedings. The general rules, most court documents are going to be open to the public, but obviously if you're trying to get a divorce, you're going to have to list off your name, social security number, a lot of financial information, because the courts have to deal with that. That doesn't mean that should be available to anyone walking to the courthouse to get it, but they're obligated to do it in order to get some kind of government service.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would agree, except that we're not talking about the courts operate under different rules, given separation of powers, and a lot of courts have been. You can go in and ask a judge to have all that stuff concealed for bankruptcy or divorce and so on. I get, you could argue that I guess if you had to give the government your information, or you're choosing to give the government information, then every driver's license would be completely public, because that's a privilege, it's not a right. Whereas voter registration, which is a right, was something we can secret. And we're back to having.
Well, I was going to say you don't have to register to vote. You kind of automatically do it for the DMV now.
That's right. That's right. But you're talking about what's a privilege, what's a right. So I
think it's an important, because one of the fundamental questions we talked about at the beginning of all of this is like, is this information that the average Oregonian would be okay with being released out to the public? And a lot of it will come down to the method in which the information came to be held by the public, which is what was the kind of the thought process of the citizen when this information went from them to the government. I'm not saying I have an answer though.
No.
It's issue spotting, yeah.
Yeah, I totally understand. Yeah. So I guess here's a question for me. Are we envisioning a recommendation that would, for the full committee, that would actually limit information that's currently available now? Or would we say, I'm going to put this in a binary, or would we say we are not advocating for exempting any information that's not, we're not adding any or broadening any exemptions. They're trying to define how people should weigh and consider the release. Some stuff's open, some stuff is conditional. That seems to be, again, agencies have a difficult time deciding how to weigh that. People want the information, have a difficult time when it doesn't seem to be consistent. That's one debate. The other debate is, are we talking about saying it's okay to put more stuff behind unconditional exemptions or conditional exemptions? And that to me is kind of a decision point, because I don't know which way we're going on that.
My take is that I don't think we're advocating to put more things
Okay.
in a confidential
Okay.
place. I think that we will, my thought is, as much as there are good policy arguments for making it easier to get at, seems to be part of our charge, but I think we also have to consider, we also don't want to, we need to decide where that line is going to be. I think at minimum, what I'm envisioning we would be recommending to the full committee would be the practical components that we know we can do, which is to come up with some kind of common definition or subsets of the definition, and trying to combine all these tentacles into one place. That at minimum I think would help a lot. But I don't see that as increasing it probably will neither increase or decrease the level of transparency currently if we just did that much.
As far as the written word, I think it would increase it if it made everyone easier to understand the balancing tests. But I don't think, what is currently exempt under here in a perfect world, I don't see that changing in a lot of ways. I think it's more about taking everything that's in the list of PII exemptions we've already got and consolidating it and making it easier for everyone to understand, which would then increase the access. But it wouldn't actually increase or decrease the amount of personal information that's currently available.
Yeah, it'd be neutral on that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's helpful, thank you.
And I haven't quite thought this through because I have to look at the different examples. But my other thought is there might be a reason to draw a distinction between people who are applying for government services of some kind versus people who work for the government. Because obviously one of the policy concerns I brought up in the past is that there is this presumption that if one goes to work for a public employer, then you're giving up your rights to privacy that would otherwise be available in the private sector. And that may be true or may not be true. Personally, I think there are good policy reasons to not do that. I don't think it should be necessary if you're going to work for a public employer that you just, your life is an open book.
It's kind of nice though.
No, well, yes and no. I mean, right now, people can get your name, obviously. They can get your job title legally. They can get your compensation. All of that stuff is exposed. But they might have to work to find out, where your house is or where your vacation home is or where your children go to school or, any of that information that doesn't have anything to do with your job.
Yeah.
It has to do with your life as a private citizen. And so that's an important distinction in my mind, because I think that when I deal with public employees all the time, and they don't want to feel like when they go home that they're not off the clock, that they're just as accessible at home as they would be at work. I mean, they're also, we saw that in a relatively recent change in the I don't know, 5-6 years ago, where employees' personal email addresses became exempt, because it used to be that if the employer kept them, which they do because that's how they reach their employees, then those were required to be disclosed if anybody asked. And so, but there didn't seem to be any compelling business reason why my home address, my home email needed to be disclosed to anybody who wanted it. So I don't know, it might not be a necessary distinction, but I'm sort of processing through all this. If I apply for if I file my deed with the county, is that different than if I work for the county and, should all that information be accessible in the same way?
Michael, excuse me, I have a quick question. You've been talking about the business purpose, right? And to some extent, have a form of that already with a public interest test, which is not quite the same thing as you're describing. So my question is really quick. The public interest test, for example, for a fee waiver, okay, it's been kind of defined by court precedent and so on. Is the public interest test for release of this kind of information, that balancing test, has that been tested out in court? Is it clear? Is there a clear definition for it?
Is it clear? I mean, courts have talked about it, but I mean, it's of a nature where you're always gonna have lawyers who can make arguments on either side of it. It's like the reasonable person standard in a court. So I would say that it, you know, what you wanna be constructing those arguments around, if you're a lawyer, is fairly clear, but like how a court is necessarily gonna come down is, you know, not certain. They put a thumb on the scale in favor of disclosure, but that doesn't mean they always order everything disclosed.
So let me ask a specific question. So for example, on fee waiver question, the ability of the requester to disseminate information to the public is a part of the test.
Mm-hmm.
Is that also a test in this public interest balancing test?
I can't think of any time when I've seen them talk about it explicitly, but there's definitely a case. I mean, they will definitely look at the purpose of the request and assessing the public interest piece, I guess, is what I would say about that.
That's also a problem with the law in general, because the public agency isn't supposed to look at who's asking for the information as a reason for saying yes or no. They're supposed to be kind of blind to it, but at the same time, there's case law that basically says, yeah, but if they're gonna use the information to ask somebody, then you should withhold it.
Right, don't give it to the stalker.
Was that Jordan, I think, the DMV or something like
Yeah.
that?
See, that's
So there, it's clear as mud. Actually, I think what is public interest for a fee waiver makes a heck of a lot more sense, and they've actually got more nuanced, more detailed, and it's a little bit more mechanical for whether that stuff should be applied than whether it should be released.
Well, that's supposed to be addressed in their adopted policies anyway, if they have them. So at least there's a little bit of clarity from agency to agency about when they will and won't waive the fees.
I totally don't.
the reason I'm asking this question is
It's lawyer talk.
part of the reason I'm asking this question is you're raising a really interesting point about the purpose of the request. So if somebody wants to have names plus addresses, what's the business purpose? Right?
Yeah, what's the reason?
Or names plus, well, zip codes necessarily wouldn't be, but names plus dates of birth, or whatever it might be, or addresses, dates, whatever it might be. And it seems to me the public interest test already serves a balancing, you know, without saying a business purpose, it can be a broader public purpose as well. And so I guess I'm wondering what more we can add to that.
And that's a good question because it's what's your name again? Michael. Sorry.
Today, my name
Until he sits at the table, he's just.
Normally we could just say chairman. As today, you know,
That's the best comment around. And again, and I'm sure that those of us who work on the government side can speak to this, it's inherently problematic because it is a judgment call. And there is a sense from local agencies, particularly those that are run by people who are not all that educated or experienced, who are like, how the heck are we supposed to decide that? So they're basically given this judgment. I get their phone calls, you know, do we disclose this or don't we disclose this? And then we have to talk about whether it's conditional, whether it's not conditional, yada, yada. And because it is subject to discretion, it is also debatable. So they end up with, well, you as a journalist would say, well, of course the public interest will be served by this. Whereas the public agency is kind of like, well, we're not buying it, so no. And then you know, so, and I don't know if we're actually going to get there, but ideally, and I know you've spoken to this as well, if we could remove any of that kind of potential for arbitrariness from this process, I think that would help the government to understand what's expected of them, and you know where are the bright lines if there are any.
Yeah. Okay.
We could take on that group in the subcommittee, better define the balancing test. So I think everyone would probably benefit from having a more clearly defined balancing test.
Would you like to create a separate subcommittee of?
No, I would not.
It might just be you. the majority.
Just me talking
And
to
a quorum.
myself. I do that
But that's a
9 to
good
5 on
point.
this, anyway.
I, first of all, I agree with you that the balancing test and the business reason they're similar animals, and I
Yes,
think you
yeah.
could call it two different things, but it's still either one, they're kind of leave it to the discretion of the entity to decide whether it works or not.
Yeah.
Okay, so going back to the original question that we had, we said that we want to define the PII, and so we had this list that we got from here, and I don't know if we should do any more validation of that list, or are we cool?
You did mention race when you gave me your examples of why.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, I mean,
I don't know that that's in any of our lists, though.
it's not, I don't know if it's something that you'd want to consider as part of that. I mean, obviously, I think it's, in and of itself, it's tough to track back to an individual.
Right.
But in conjunction with other things on that list, it'd be easy to track back to an individual with racial or demographic information like that.
Yeah, so that's probably part of that, like, if we're gonna talk about a data classification system, there should be, here's the individual pieces of information, here's the pieces of information when combined.
It's problematic.
Are problematic, and then, and by problematic, I mean, I wonder if we should define problematic, because I feel like the working definition we've got just from the conversation is like what gives an agency pause when they're asked to disclose.
Well, if we take it back and say, what would the standard Oregonians or citizen expect to be held in confidence versus expect to be public?
Right.
And ultimately, if we're trying to set policy, is what would the population itself think is acceptable?
I want to I totally respect what you're saying. I have problems with putting this finger in the wind at what people might think, because they can say everything.
Yeah.
Gender, race, address, middle name, cat's name, everything. That's just not, I don't think that's in the broader public interest. So I guess the problem is that people have different expectations, what would be fair for everybody and what's fair for me. And I see that both, I know I'm saying this from my perspective as having worked as a journalist, and unfortunately have not had the experience of people trying to harass me at home or track me down. I'm acknowledging this, I happen to be so empathetic to that. Right? But I think, again, we get back to the question of what's the expectation? Do we volunteer information to the government to take advantage of a privilege versus give it to take advantage of a right? What expectations do we give up when we provide? There are businesses, for example, who would argue, hey, I want some tax subsidy from the government, but everything I tell the government can be confidential. And that's a real situation. They don't have a right to get subsidized, but they get it, whether it's tax breaks or whatever it might be. And so that becomes, and I know we're not talking about personal information there, but we're still talking about this principle of what gets volunteered versus what's expected. So I struggle with that a little bit, because I think we're then on the road to advocating more information should be closed off than is there now. That's my personal concern.
Do you have any sense, and you might not be able to address this, but if you could speak for all Oregon journalists, what are the primary obstacles that they find? Can they be defined, or is it just a matter of inconsistent application of the law, or?
I can give one.
Yeah.
It's agencies that by default just say no, that they have established a policy of no.
And that's just it? They don't give you a reason?
Yeah.
Okay, my
And they
clients
just-
don't do that.
No, much nicer clients.
I think
Tell them you know me.
I think our clients do that in situations where they don't call us.
Well, that's good. Or 6 months down the road, they say, we told them no 6 months ago, and now they're suing us, what do we do?
Yeah, so I think the thing that got raised in this stack of documents was timely access, right?
Yeah.
So there's something that's happening, like, there's something that's happening and they're trying to get access to information, and the longer the agency can stall, essentially, the more difficult it is to get the information and contact the people and get their recollections or whatever. And so that's the strategy. So that's one.
So it's a really great question. So
Thank you.
So if I dare try to speak for the whole profession, I won't do that. But I can tell you that it's different ranges. You can be on a deadline, and you need to know that the John Smith you're writing about is the one who actually died in a car crash, not the John Smith who maybe lives in the same street or the same town, or drives a similar car, you know. So the ability to get dates of birth, address, neighbors, all that kind of information, which is often a two-step process, right? You get a name, and then you can go over here, or you get something else and go over here with public records, right? Now, putting aside the access to commercial databases, just for a minute. On deadline for verification can be absolutely critical. Spelling someone's name, getting their age right. So this can be absolutely critical for verification. And how important is it? People say if you can't get people's names spelled right, how can we believe anything else you say? So that's a big part of it, as well as whatever concerns a news outlet might have about vulnerabilities of saying, frankly, this is simply not true because the information wasn't accessible at the time. That's on one end. All the way up to long-term projects, or where you need to, or a data project where you're trying to find patterns. It all becomes, there's lots of different ways. There's great examples in here. I can't speak to all the examples in here, but I can speak personally to various times when we're trying to show that there's a pattern of a problem. In order to do that, sometimes you have to get down into the details of who were the individuals. Students of mine just published a story in Eugene about an effort there to try to create they did create a community court to try to help people who were homeless. The city is seeing it's a great success. Students were able to get the names of the people into the court system. It showed that this group was going back into court, being convicted at the same rate as they were before, so the recidivism rate hasn't changed. Without names, without access to certain people, and that's within a municipal court. So this is a city, this executive branch. You couldn't do that, and that took them months. So it's a range of things, and most often it's to verify who we're talking about. It's to verify or to be able to identify patterns or trends, and it's not just precision, but it's also trying to see things that aren't otherwise immediately visible in the public interest, which can mean getting people's names and addresses, and dates of birth. For example. So it's a whole range of things. Now you ask what the hardest thing is. On the public interest test, I would say it is agencies, and this is the exception, not the rule, that say, no, it's public, it's personal information, absolutely not. And you have to weigh it and say, can we really make the argument that this person's name or this person's address on a police report, for example, or their phone number, it's really in the public interest that be released. You have to weigh that every time. Versus agencies that simply do say, we're just going to make it difficult. And there are agencies that do make it difficult because they're, I think, in part afraid of releasing too much. And then the other perspective, no, I want to be accused of letting out too much information. And so, because it's a balancing test, because it's subjective, frustrations that journalists face are the agencies that just that have a habit or a pattern of just not letting anything out, and you have to fight for every bit of information, as opposed to the active weighing. And this is difficult because state agencies, the AG's office has been fairly consistent over time. District attorneys are very different at the local level. Yeah.
County councils.
What's that?
County
They're the
councils
worst.
are the worst.
I think county councils are doing their job. I mean, you got so much else to consider besides just what the journalist wants, right?
Yeah.
Right. So when I'm talking about district attorneys in terms of when they get their petitions over if there's a disagreement, they have to make a decision on petitions. So I think it's expediency, or should I say efficiency, for journalists to get the information quickly, and where agencies simply aren't willing to hear the public interest test. and then your fingers are crossed that someone up the appeals process will hear that. But that gets into, it becomes very subjective. Long answer, sorry.
No, that's helpful, thank you. And I guess another question I would have is from a journalist perspective, is it the obtaining, some of this information is only going to be available from a government agency, like a police report, for example. But is the thinking that the easiest and fastest way to obtain this information is from a public entity, or is it, or would there be other ways to get it if the public entity said no? You see what I'm saying? Is it frustrating for journalists because that's the only place you can get it and you're not getting it? Or is it frustrating because it's going to take you a lot longer to get it from somewhere else than to just go directly to the source?
It's a great question. So if it's if it's a single story where you're just trying to verify somebody's name or where they live, I don't know. We don't typically, the pattern of the newspapers I worked at was no longer to publish people's addresses. In the old days, you would publish addresses almost all the time. We haven't done that for a long time, generally speaking. So when you're trying to verify it and you become accustomed to checking voter registration cards, or media still have access to some DMV records under certain circumstances, that's built in. You become accustomed to that as habit. If that was taken away, it would be difficult, particularly if you're on deadline. The alternative are these commercial databases, which draw from all kinds of records, right? And not everybody can afford those. First of all, not all news agencies have access to that. And the question then becomes, if we start closing off information, can the commercial companies that collect that data even collect it? And pretty soon, there's a closing off of all kind of, it becomes much patchier.
Well, and like that, sorry, this is my own bias coming out too about those kinds of organizations. Like, there's really varying levels of accuracy. Like, it's people put a lot of
like Wikipedia.
faith in, yeah, exactly, right? And it's all, it's only as accurate as the last time that data was gathered from wherever it was gathered from, right?
They aren't updating it,
And who knows? You don't really know. So I
Exactly right.
wouldn't trust them.
You don't necessarily know. Like, you can type my name in, and you can find 14 places I've lived in the last 30 years, right? Well, is that coming from credit card applications? Is it coming from magazine subscriptions? And so the rule of thumb is to never trust that for publication.
Right.
So
It's a place to start, like Wikipedia, but you would verify it.
I wish I thought of this earlier. I could have answered this much more quickly. Journalists tend to rely, and I would say researchers and all sorts of other folks tend to rely on government information as official information. In other words, you have to have some degree of veracity behind it. And that's why we rely on it. So that's why access to a lot of this information is, saying this is an official document.
Yeah,
makes a huge difference. So.
Yeah, and so there's like an entire economy around like selling people's information, right? And I would, from just like a citizen standpoint, I would rather that our government be the source of official information about whether like I'm alive or dead or whatever than some credit reporting,
right?
Company. Yeah, and I guess like for me, like framing our government agencies as a source of trusted information is like an interesting framing. Like I don't know that everybody like thinks about it that way, but I think when it comes down to it, like people do have that sense that if they ask a government agency for a piece of information, that it's going to be accurate, and that. To me, that's like a critical piece of why it's important for these agencies to provide the information. Mm-hmm. Not why they should always provide it, but just like why that's like an important part of the openness of government. And if we stop trusting our government to provide accurate information, then that's like a real big problem.
You think? No one in government would lie. Come on. They're just mistaken.
Right, and so then you have, like an organization, media that like kind of helps check in on that.
To go back to your original question briefly, when I teach this stuff to students, I hand out this long list of places to go for public information. 3/4 of it, people can get without filing a records request. Assessor's information, right?
Quick phone call.
Recorder's office, right, exactly. And so when you ask what for journals used for verification, a lot of it, we don't have to go through those steps. The public doesn't have to go through those steps, not just us, right? So I think the frustration is when the balancing test is in place, and the agency may not have experience, the agency may not have faced this request before. It's the delay is part of it, but the concern that we can't get to it, obviously, is always going to be that concern. Again, talking about this one small but important group, you asked me for that in general respect.
So that's helpful, thank you.
Yeah, I wonder, like, I have a question as representatives of government. Is that, that base, like, the reason why people are coming to you for this information is because the government is the source of trusted information here. Is that part of, like, the thinking behind it? Like, do they have that, like, feeling about it at all? Like, is that part of the calculus?
Because they know they have a good chance of getting it because of the public records law.
That's right.
I see.
Yeah, I don't know that I mean, because I represent a variety of different local governments, they're all a little bit different in terms of what information they have.
Yeah.
And what someone might be coming to them for, but, and their varying levels of willingness to cooperate. I would say that the requests that they get that I would term, legitimate requests, like a genuine interest, journalist, NGO, a nonprofit, somebody who just kind of wants information, like I want information about that project that you're doing to restore the wetland out here,
Yeah.
That kind of stuff is, most of my clients would be more than happy to do it, and they do it as timely as they can.
And it never crosses our desk, generally speaking, either.
Our desk, whose desk? Yeah, exactly.
lawyer's
They're not
desk.
talking to the lawyers
No.
about it, yeah. If a lawyer is, if your client is well-trained, they know when the little red flags come up that maybe I should ask my lawyer what to do here.
Yeah.
And if the lawyer knows what they're doing, then they'll coach them through that. And it's a fairly, at least in my experience, not that long a process. I'm not one of those lawyers who sits on things for months, but some do. I think that the problem and the thing that, and we see, and it is rampant, is the number of sort of self-appointed vigilantes who decided that there is some sort of conspiracy going on, and damn it, I'm going to get to the bottom of it.
Yeah.
And they harass the crap out of them because they insist, I know the law better than you do, and there is that member of the public component, and it is I don't know how it is in other states, but there are pockets of Oregon where there is a strong libertarian bent, and they tend to believe that the government is bad and evil and corrupt, and so they tend to sort of behave accordingly.
I'm from Montana. I'm familiar with
You know
this,
that mindset then.
Yeah.
So I don't mean ramble. I can give you lots of different examples.
I wrote down vigilantes.
Well, I mean, it's kind of self-appointed watchdogs.
Yeah, exactly, and they kind of don't
Overly
believe,
interested citizens.
don't believe that the government is telling them the truth, and in some cases they may be right, but generally speaking, there is an expectation that when I say hop, you're going to hop, and if you're not giving me what I'm asking for, it's because you're hiding it, and it's like, well, no, it's because there is no such beast or something like that. So there are tools built in within the law to sort of empower. Again, this is something that I teach to local government clients. Is there are tools in the law to help manage that process, like the ability to get clarification on a request, the ability to require the deed in writing, the ability to charge a fee for copying and whatnot. So I encourage them to do that, but in many cases it's just not enough. So people come, I think the requesters come with all kinds of motives, and generally the ones who seem to be doing it in good faith, I don't think they encounter a lot of resistance. I think at least, and I can't speak for all of them, but for my clients, they see it as kind of a pain in the butt, but they recognize that it is their obligation to do it, so.
I see.
And then the recent edition, the 2018 edition of the time deadlines now is something that we're having to pay closer attention to because it's now spelled out in the statute.
And like, is there a point at which like a government agency decides that someone is just harassing and then
They decided they can't do anything about it.
they can't do anything?
I know some that have done something about it, not my clients, but yeah,
What did they do?
but responding to this guy's wasting their time.
So what happened?
I'm still fighting to get by it somewhere.
Well, in my experience, it is that that many of my clients have that sort of self-appointed watchdog person that is going to come in there, and they have a sort of shelf life. I mean, they do it until they get bored with it, which is it becomes a hobby for about maybe a year or two. I have a current client who's had someone like that that's been, we're going on 4 years of grappling with this guy. He comes to their meetings and screams and yells. But anyway, I have been sort of walking them through this, and they finally they weren't giving him stuff for free. They were letting him, being really nice, and then they stopped being nice and started enforcing their policy. And so he has talked to his local congressperson, who has basically told him, you don't have anything to complain about. He's talked to the DA more than once, and the DA has said, you don't have anything. He's now suing my client in circuit court for alleged violations of the law. So, and that's an extreme example, but it's not unusual. So I can't remember what the original question was because I was just
No, it's okay. You mentioned this before. I was asking kind of the other question. You're asking about what problems journalists face, and I was kind of getting to what are problems that government face with these issues. And I think that something I'm interested in on these issues that the local governments are facing, is that something that we should make a recommendation about? Or is it something that's maybe like another part of the law that the legislature should address? Or, what? Like, do you think that this should, I guess the core of the question is, do you think this should be built into our work? Like making a recommendation about this, like, behavior that's harassing, or should it be something else?
Yeah, then that's a very good question. My overall sense is that it's a separate issue from the whole exemption thing. I would love to see and be a part of developing some ways for the government agency to kind of not have the crap beaten out of them in these situations. We do what we can, but as far as the exemptions go, I think the only area that we were mentioned earlier is that kind of, as much of that kind of subjectivity can be taken out of the law. I think that would help greatly, because they would like to be able to say, this is what the law requires us to do, and we did it, so we're done, as opposed to that kind of back and forth arguing about it.
Yeah, and that comes into the subjective nature of the balancing test, I think. And the other piece of that is the potential exposure or liability of a government agency for erring too far on the side of disclosure. If there was a blanket liability waiver or exemption for public agencies for releasing too much information, I'd be willing to bet there'd be the pendulum would swing some. Because you get, especially for PII, like a lot of places just don't, the person who gets the request for a certain amount of information will look at it and it just doesn't pass the smell test. Not going to say no, because I think we're going to get sued if we turn it over, or something bad could happen to this person if we turn it over. I think that's a big issue.
That's a really interesting idea.
And is there an example of that kind of liability waiver?
I think there was in some of the stuff
Was
that
in
Jake put together.
Ginger? Okay.
She had some stuff about some states have processes where, and I mentioned it earlier, that essentially the person signs the agreement that they'll receive it for X purpose and they'll only use it for X purpose. And if they don't, in theory, the liability shifts to them. As a practical matter, I don't think it would really work in Oregon, because an individual citizen has a whole lot less insurance than a government agency does.
Yes.
That's why, as the county, we get sued for a lot of car accidents, because it was our road. So if they could find a way to make it the road's fault for the accident, we have a heck of a lot more insurance than the other person driving the vehicle.
Right.
I would, so I'm interested in the experiences you have. So if you get 100 calls about public records issues in a year, when you get all this, out of 100, how many are dealing with PI, the personal information, this question of personal privacy? You have people who are taking up a lot of your time because they're like you see, the folks who won't let go of something. But they may not necessarily be going after personal information. How often do these issues, this like, how much do we let go? It becomes what you deal with or what you get calls about.
A fair number, a lot out of the sheriff's office, because I get a lot of personally identifiable information in every police report.
Right, absolutely.
So I don't know, I couldn't give you a percentage,
Okay.
but a decent amount.
Okay.
But also, it depends on the method in which we got the information. You're going to be less likely to get some information out of a police report, doubly so if it's a police report about child abuse.
Right.
Whereas if you go to the assessor's office and look for a name and an address, you'll get it on the phone without question.
Right.
I mean, actually, most of our assessor's records are all mapped online through interactive map. You can click on a parcel and see who owns it through our website.
Right.
And you can see our taxes and what the house is worth and everything else.
Right.
And you go to Google Maps and find it.
Actually, we
Figure
have
out how to get there.
we have on our website essentially our own version of Google Maps.
Really?
And you can click on the parcel, and maybe from there it'll tell you right there who owns it. You can click on the last few years of tax statements. You can see all the deeds associated with it.
Do you get MapQuest directions to how to get
No
there?
MapQuest.
That's close.
We do, but a lot of it is fueled with data that we get from the same people that provide like Google Maps or data, so you can get a map. And so we're one of the few counties that does that. I think there's 2 or 3 others.
Portland Maps has that too. Yeah,
I think
very detailed.
I think Deschutes County has something similar.
Lane doesn't have to, so.
Yeah. You can also do an electronic search of all of our deed records online, just through our website. And that's something that would be, reduces the number of requests we're gonna actually get, because you can literally just go into our clerk's office or website and just say, type in someone's name and see any deeds that are attached to that name.
And I think that trend is more and more common in that, to the extent that public records are not exempt from disclosure, many agencies allow you to just go and get them, regardless. You don't have to make a public records request. So for actually receiving a public records request, it's usually for something that is not freely accessible.
Okay.
But we're also gonna be a little bit biased, because the easy requests aren't gonna come to our desks.
Right.
Yeah, exactly, that's true.
I figured you seem to like the tough ones, right? Okay, thank you.
So what I have from our discussion just on this, like defining PII and whether or not different kinds of PII should be treated differently, I have this definition that we've put together. I have a request to kind of formalize that definition as like a thing that we send to the other committee, and then I don't know how to do this, but like maybe offer where to combine the statutes that define this in one place. Is that like, that's kind of part of, so that's probably like an action item basically to look at where, maybe?
I'd put it in 192,
Yeah.
or as 192, which is the public records statute, if it were up to me, because that's the place where most decision makers go to find out what is disclosable and what isn't.
Okay,
Because there's,
making this easy.
how many exemptions are outside of 192, Mr. Cronin?
Sorry, what?
How many exemptions exist outside of 192?
Like 470?
It'd be nice if we could get those all into one section.
192 will be its own volume, it'll be.
I actually
600 page
once took a stab at that at the request of the prior Attorney General John Kroger. So it would no longer be Okron, and even at the time it probably had some holes, but there was a Senate bill proposed in like the 2011 session, I want to say, that has the best guess at what a comprehensive catalog would look like. And that was actually just like putting all the citations in one place, and the citations in one place is probably like this bad if you printed it.
Then you just have to go look up the citation.
Yeah, so we now have a catalog on our website that's like searchable and electronic, and we've attach some information to it, like if a court has interpreted it, here's the site to the court case.
Very helpful, I used it this morning.
Okay.
Didn't get an answer, still working on it.
Well, they haven't all been, I mean, the courts haven't had a chance to be through all that. There's a lot. Anyway, it's.
Well, and in light of that, is our idea that maybe we could combine all this in one statute realistic?
At least for PII.
I think
You
so.
know, think so?
I mean, you know, legislative council are not, they're no dummies. They can figure out what pieces of the statutes outside of the public records law need to be changed and how.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay, so that sounds like one piece of information we can pass back. Another thing is better defining the balancing test. And I feel like that's like a conversation that we would need to have and sort of like frame it. Like, here's the balancing test, here's problems from different constituencies that we need to take into account, and then maybe a working session to try to like work through some of that, like what would we change? Does that sound like a meeting? Or no? What do you think? I mean,
it sounds like a meeting and a good conversation. My concern is that we'll just sit and spin our wheels like we do every time we try to talk about that, but.
Is there anything that would help, like, do you feel like there's anything that would help make decisions there, like more information or maybe examples to run through the balancing test, or?
I mean, I think you could get there somehow. Okay, so like these are the 10 things that we determine to be what is or is not public interest. And I think anything could have more definitional certainty than just what's the public interest, because defining public interest is depending on who's asking and why.
Right.
I think if you had concrete examples of what the public interest actually was.
You put in some criteria for making that call.
Yeah.
Yeah, rather than just leave it a blanket statement. I like that actually, because as I'm thinking about that, it would sort of chip away at the current state of the law, which is we can't consider motive, because I think you could sort of, for example, if one of the things that you were considering is the request coming from a journalist and for what purpose, that would carry more weight in terms of deciding it's in the public interest than if it's a not journalist, for example. I mean, my worry about that, and as I mentioned the last meeting, my understanding is I saw a bill that is being proposed that would treat journalists or members of the media as their own sort of special category in terms of accommodating their requests. But I was asked to comment, and my comment was, yeah, that's fine if you're going to come up with a definition of what qualifies as media.
I absolutely love that idea until you try to figure out what is media.
Yeah, exactly. What is media? So somebody would have to figure that one out.
Okay.
Well, there's the definition that someone came up with, maybe the city of Lake Oswego, for executive session purposes.
We published an opinion the AG did a few years ago on the public meeting law executive session meeting, but it's tied to specific language in the public meeting statute.
Yeah.
About when you could have a public meeting?
No, who's permitted to attend the executive session?
Oh, I see. But one of the advice I give my clients is you guys decide who in your opinion qualifies as media. Adopt a policy, make official, make everybody know, this is who we consider media for purposes of executive session. And it hasn't been challenged yet, but at least it's some kind of standard that they can adopt so that it looks like they're not being arbitrary.
Yeah, but if we get a similar definition in statute, it might be helpful.
That would be helpful. Yeah, I like the establishing like when deciding whether something is in the public interest, these are the considerations that can be, looked at or weighed or whatever, and it kind of like the whole findings thing, like public contracting, you have to make findings. It gives you a bunch of criteria to consider, and you just have to be able to prove that you considered them.
And is this a request? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So the like coming up with examples of what is in the public interest, is that like a request that we can make of an agency? Like, is there an agency that could say, here's like some stuff that's in public interest? Should we just ask like different groups, like interest groups, to tell us what they think is public interest? Like, what would be a way to just get some examples, basically?
Peanut Galleries wants to weigh in.
Yes, please.
I have the thought that it would be sufficient to advise the legislature that more clarity and specifications and even examples around the public interest should be adopted and would be helpful, and that the legislative process is actually probably the best suited to
Okay.
fleshing that out.
Good strategy. I like that.
Also, like, doable.
That's right,
Yeah.
take can and kick it.
Well, I mean, honestly, like, the legislature is gonna hear from stakeholders.
Yeah, they're gonna have a lot
That's a
better
good point.
capacity to bring a bunch of stakeholders in to testify.
So we just, if our only recommendation is we think we need to look at this, I think I like that. Add some clarity, legislative clarity to
Give
that.
criteria and or examples.
And, you know, it would probably be helpful to illuminate for them some of the things Brent was talking about in order to sort of give context to the recommendation.
So for, I don't dare try to pretend to be a lawyer here, but I'm looking at the handbook, right? And the question in the public interest test, it broadly defined it as the value to the public at large, not to a particular person at a particular time. There is this question of like, should there be a filter at the front end? Who's asking you, why do you want it, right? And I think it's problematic, right? But if we're talking about the pursuit of, as in general terms, what people define as personally identifiable information, the agency can say, the requester can make clear, but the agency can say, this seems to be something that you want as an individual versus something that could potentially serve the public. And I think part of the problem becomes how far does the requester have to go to prove that it will absolutely serve the public versus the potential for it. And there's a question of burden, right? The agency has the burden to show something should be with, the burden is on the agency when the requester makes the initial request, and the burden shifts to the requester for I think, am I getting this right? So if we can ask for more clarity about if the agency is withholding because this test hasn't been met, what are the reasons, rather than just saying nope, because that's problematic.
Mhm.
You don't know why. You can make the arguments very clearly. You believe that there's a broad public interest. I'm not just looking for somebody in particular's home address in this case. So I would be leery about trying to offer those kinds of examples. But I guess in terms of if we're going to continue with the balancing test, make the how am I trying to say this? Make the burdens, if we're not going to shift the burden, make the standards a little bit clearer as to if the burden is not met from the agency's perspective as to why.
Yeah, and one way we could frame it in the Sunshine Committee terms is like add transparency to the decision-making process of the agency.
That might help, right? Because I think we're in a place where we're not going to get past that subjective balance, right?
And I'll just throw in this as well. I'm assuming, currently under the law, there are the exemptions that are just exemptions, and then there are the ones that are conditional exemptions, right? The balancing test only applies to the conditional ones. So as we're talking about this, is it fair to say that, is the argument here that we should apply the balancing test to all exemptions, or is it just that for those that are currently conditionally exempt, we need more clarity and more transparency with respect to the test, how the test is applied?
Personally, I would like it to be broader, but and we're not talking about the ones that are unconditionally exempt. But here, of course, we're just talking about PII. To me, it's like when the burden shifts back to the requester off the government, that's where it becomes problematic. If it's fees, if it's this test for disclosure, whatever it might be, that's just what I bring to the table here. But if we're going to acknowledge that this is problematic. I mean, it's a challenge for everybody. There's still a lack of certainty for agencies about what to do. There's a lack of information from requesters about why they're not seeing things. To maybe a broader recommendation to the legislature could be that to make it really clear that the case has got to be, where the burden is, what should be part of that case, or the argument, and what the burden is of if the agency is left with a decision not to disclose, what the responsibilities are of the agency to come forward with the reasons as to why the test wasn't met, for example. So that might be one broader recommendation. Increase transparency around the decision.
Yeah, and I think that if we had access to that information as a committee today, then I think we would actually be able to give more advice. I mean, that was one of the original problems that we had. Like, one of the questions that we raised very early on was like, okay, so we have all these exemptions, how often are they being invoked? No one knows.
And the problem is every request is its own beast or its own animal, in terms of or species in some ways. It's good because it can be different from agency to agency, requester to requester.
Yep.
It's really hard to generalize, so that's why we're short. Part of the reason I think we're struggling. So.
Yeah, and one of the things that I thought about was like for each one of the requests, I'm not sure if it's like every request or every request that's granted, we can see what that request is and what the data was that came out of it, but you don't know about the requests that were denied necessarily. Like we're not logging all of the requests, right? Because of all the agencies that like you're representing, they don't have like a central log of all of the requests that have ever been made, right? Like
they're supposed to keep a record of it all.
Yeah.
Sure.
Some are better at that than others, but it may just be written, a file folder somewhere.
Right. Yeah. So I think that just asking that the reasoning be documented, I think is what I would suggest. And then in the case of, situation where the agency is using a portal, then it's like right there. It's pretty easy to put it there. And then in these other cases, they're going to have to figure out like how to add like the line to their log or whatever. But I think that would help a lot so that if anybody comes back and looks at these again, right, and they've got a source of data to say, okay, here's where these are being used and how they're being used.
Which makes me think of a different kind of side point, which I don't want to derail us on this, but the other question, some of the examples that you were offering about, verification of the spelling of a name or something like that, those are not necessarily public records requests. Those are just requests for information, right?
Right.
And you're going to be getting those in a phone call, probably. So one of the other issues that my clients sometimes deal with is not necessarily an exemption issue, but is the requests that are being made are, to the extent that they're specific, like any records relating to the purchase of the property last year and blah, blah, those are fairly easy. But you get these sort of requests for, they're not necessarily looking for records. They just want somebody to explain to me what the heck happened here. I try to encourage my clients to just talk to these people and tell them what happened, and that might be all they need. But on the other hand, one of the things that they grapple with is we don't have a document that explains all that. We may have, we have to procure the phone records, we'd have to procure the memos, we'd have to procure, all this kind of stuff. So there's that kind of narrowing down the request to, are you looking just for confirmation of information, or you actually want a record? That's kind of a side issue, but it also tends to come up in that how to frame the request in such a way that it ties in with the statutory exemptions, as opposed to having to sort of guess what the person is looking for.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to something that you were saying about like helping citizens narrow and frame the request that they're making, because sometimes they don't know how to do it.
Yeah, they're not sure what they're looking for.
Yeah.
Can I toss out an idea, given it's a quarter
Yeah, of course.
This has been great, by the way. Thank you. I learned a ton from everyone here. Thank you for all of it.
It's working out of a smaller group. It's a lot more conversational.
Even when we're live on TV.
Yeah, how's it going, Emily? Are you still there? No, she's like, I'm done.
She's like, Michael's here.
Yes, I'm here. I'm
Oh,
muted, but I'm here.
Okay, let's go on. So our goal, our immediate particular goal is to produce something for the committee.
Yeah.
All right. What do you think about the possibility that everyone puts something down in writing with an understanding that we are trying to describe what we see as the issues both that we're all dealing with and both our own experiences, because that's why we're here. We all have particular experiences, right? To reflect all that and see, I bet that we have a lot of agreement if we can just find the language. But again, we're sending something to the committee to send recommendation to the legislature. We're not writing the bill, right? And that will also perhaps parse out where we may not be able to agree here, and the committee may not be able to agree. We can give the committee options, and we can, and the committee can also make, for example, potentially say to the legislature, we couldn't agree on this because it's clearly a public policy question, or whatever it might be. So we sort of put aside what we can agree on. Like we might be able to do PII pretty quickly, right? We might be able to just characterize the general tensions here pretty quickly. In other words, put the language of 4 or 5 people together and just say, okay, because that's really what we're trying to do. Right? We're trying to get this down. And then with the caveat that if like for example, I write something and I'm not characterizing it the way anybody else would want it, it's all malleable till we can all kind of agree, or we can seek a way to agree. So just everybody kick in their ideas and how we could write this.
Yeah. Well, I think we got a good example going already.
Yes.
Yeah, and
build off of all the work we've already done.
Yeah, and so I can just like share this document, and then we'll also have the recording of the meeting if you want to go back and hear like what we actually talked about. So I can share this out, and then what I would do with that is to take this and kind of distill like, there's 3 main points that I saw from the conversation, the definition, recommendation on where to put it, I put those together. Recommendation about better defining the balancing test, the advice to the legislature, and I have like these comments that I put in here as we were talking. And then the last thing was the helping the agencies deal with the fear of liability for disclosing too much. So what can we do to like help support the agencies there, and maybe there's nothing, I don't know, but we can at least like suggest.
I mean, there already is an exemption or a liability disclosure, but it's basically useless.
Yeah.
In my opinion, but I'm a pessimist at heart. I mean, it's about disclosure of personal information. If the public agency can demonstrate with, I think it was clear and convincing evidence, I just have the statute up and I'll check it out, that there was public interest in the release, then we are exempt from disclosure, and as a result, you just end up relitigating the public interest test.
Yeah, exactly.
And it might cost you $30,000 in legal fees to get the answer to find out if you're right or wrong, and so that's.
And does it make, sorry.
No, but that's really interesting, because clear and convincing, of course, is a whole different test.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, of course, I'm just dawning on me. It's not a whole different test than the test to release. So what would we be talking about, sort of reconciling the two?
Well, that and the statutes already have a different burden for who has the burden, or has it's a burden is on the requester for like employee personal information and for home health care workers.
Right.
But for everything else, the burden is on the agency to demonstrate that there is not public interest. So it flip-flops based on what exact information is being asked for. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
What were the 2? It was the home health care?
Where is that? Where's that general?
So that was a new statute from like 2 years ago. I think it came out of the DPSST litigation.
The home health care, right?
Mm-hmm.
But is there
There's another one. I just have.
You said employee.
Yeah, there's the new statute where if you get personal information, if you get a request for information about employees' personal information, it lists off like home address, email, phone number, home phone number. then the requester has the burden to show that there's a public interest for it. And then if it's about your employees, you as the employer then have to notify the employees that this information is about to be released, and then wait a minimum of 7 days before you can release it. And then it can go out. Essentially, the way I read that is essentially if it's a representative group of people or a large swath of people, they'll have the ability to band together either individually or through their unions to be able to then, on their own, essentially fight against the release of the information rather than keeping the employer in the middle of it, but it still puts a pretty big burden on the employer. And those are, the statute itself is 192.363.
I should know this. Sorry.
Yeah.
They
And
keep changing the darn laws.
so someone had to redraft all of 192, which sadly I had close to memorize.
Okay, that's the new number?
That's the new number, yeah.
And so,
And it relates only to the home health care worker requests information, and then also the definition of public employees' personal information. And that is address, residential telephone number, personal telephone number, personal email, driver's license, ID cards, emergency contact information, SSNs, date of birth, and any other telephone numbers contained in our personnel files.
So when you were talking before about a liability exemption, were you talking about a broader one, not just for public employees or home health care workers?
Yeah,
but for the public.
I'd like
just
one in general for all public requests.
Okay.
There is one.
I know the one specific for personal information.
No, there's the general one in chapter 192. I don't remember exactly what the new site is either, but I think it's towards the end. It's right.
Is that part of what was just changed?
That's
like,
true,
To
that's right.
2018 legislation?
Yeah, so
The older
it's
membership.
part of the same statute that also says you don't waive privileges by disclosing public records.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
Yeah, so what I was looking at was 192.380. And that's specific immunity for liability for personal information.
Okay. So I guess non-lawyer question here. Clear and convincing evidence. The burden's on the agency to show that by clear and convincing evidence that you were persuaded that this information should be released.
Let's see, let's read what the immunity is. Are you talking about for the immunity piece or for whether or not?
I'm at 387.1.
380, yeah. I'm not a judge, so I don't know.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, I guess my general.
Above my pay grade.
So here we are down. I
Yeah.
guess my general perspective would be is that if agencies would feel have some, maybe not certainty, but have some burden of the doubt that goes on, really, if there was greater liability exemption for releasing information that you were persuaded met the public interest test, that would help. So that's what I hear you saying.
Okay.
Then,
That's one of my big concerns. Most of the requests I get are for sensitive information related to our behavioral health people that are under probation, parole probation supervision, or information contained in police reports. And that's all very sensitive information, but there's also not the world's cleanest exemptions for a lot of it. And that's my big concern is, and this comes from the public and also people in the media requesting this stuff. It's like, am I going to get sued by the people whose information I'm releasing?
okay, that's really helpful.
Yeah. So, the big example of how open some of the police records are that kind of terrified me. It wasn't until a year or two ago that the images of deceased persons were actually made exempt. And even then, it's a conditional exemption. If they can show that the family would not be harmed by a release of a deceased individual's photograph, it still goes out.
yeah, I mean, gruesomely, I can understand like some of the reasoning about that, but, yeah.
We get a lot of that stuff from, not from journalists, but from insurance companies looking at that information related to liability claims, with the police reports, kind of stuff.
Yeah. They want to use it at trial, like pictures of dead people. This
Potentially.
is what happened.
They asked for everything related to like a fatal car accident, and so it wasn't until 2 years ago we could actually withhold the images. They're gonna get the rest of the report with a lot of the personal information redacted out for that kind of stuff.
It's interesting. So up until 2 years ago, there wasn't even a conditional exemption for the images.
You could make a general exemption for, what's the real general one of just,
It's interesting, because I've seen cases and been part of cases. I've never personally asked for photos for the, like that. But I've seen
yeah, so
cases
there's,
where those records were withheld.
there's the unreasonable invasion of privacy exemption, which is
Yeah.
what people used before.
Right, that's what,
But that's such a wishy-washy standard that, again, it's terrifying to have to try and apply it similar to any other balancing test. It's all subjective.
okay. Well, this exemption issue, I'm glad you brought that up. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so I put as the action, does that seem reasonable for each of us to take a stab at some recommended language, and then we can workshop that at our next meeting?
Sounds
Thank you for that suggestion. That's really great.
Can I make a small suggestion on top of your suggestion? I think it is a great idea. But I think until your next meeting or until you post the material at once for your next meeting, you guys don't want to be like sharing drafts between yourselves.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so we will bring our drafts, and if you want me to, like, I'm happy to print out copies for everybody and have that ready collated. If you want to send them to me just before the meeting, if you give me like 2 hours, that's all I need.
There's no problem with posting it publicly well before that.
Yeah.
It's just you don't want to be sharing it between.
With each other.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We can share it with you directly as long as
Yes,
you share it with
yeah,
each
you
other.
can share with me directly, and I'm happy to
Right.
make copies.
CCs and reply alls are bad.
Yeah, okay, so I put in here what our action is, that each member of the committee drafts some language for discussion at the next meeting of a recommendation for the Sunshine Committee. Yeah,
Okay.
sweet.
Nice.
Thank you.
Feels good to make a little headway, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then the last bit of business is, I'll just, you know what I'll do is did that doodle thing, I know it's like overwhelming, the number of things in it, but was that okay for like organizing the next meeting?
Work for me.
Yeah,
Always
Yeah,
another way to
the
do
question
it.
is, did it work for you? Were you
Oh,
able
yeah,
to
yeah,
get
yeah,
everything
yeah,
you needed
that's-
from it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Pretty easy to fill it out.
I still just can't get over the fact that we use something called doodle holes for legitimate reasons. When it first started getting used like 4 years ago, I was like, what Mickey Mouse product? No, it turns out that's the industry standard.
I still have that too. I just about use it.
Same with SurveyMonkey. How is that a legitimate product that people just use constantly? It's like, can you cannot come up with a better name than SurveyMonkey?
And MailChimp.
MailChimp, yes.
The names just get worse from there. Yeah.
But no, I think the doodle works great.
Okay,
It's the easiest way, it's hurting cats otherwise.
okay,
Yep,
awesome.
I'm all for that. That's fine.
I will do that, and cool, I think we're good.
Okay,
2
thank you
minutes
for your
to
leadership.
spare.
Thanks.
Thank you all, you are all great.
Where are we
Your own
using it
leadership.
next time?
Thanks for doing
Turn
it.
up the phone again?
I have room for, I don't have any way to record the meeting, though. I was gonna offer our conference room, but.
Where-
All right.
where's your conference?
We're gonna disconnect, thank you, Emily.
Bridgeport Village.
Bye, thank you.
Bye.
I'm